Helps if I turn that on. Good morning and welcome to the Joint Sunset Review Committee hearing on the Board of Pilot Commissioners for the San Francisco, for the bays of San Francisco, San Pablo, and Suisun. We don't have any scheduled votes for today, so our members may be coming and going. Since I will request that everybody come down now, but wanted to thank Assemblymember Paul Cook for being here on time as always. Thank you. And I did want to start with some opening remarks and thank the board for cooperating with this first oversight hearing. I think it is commendable that I know a lot of government agencies, boards, and commissions are very nervous about going through the sunset review process. We expected that when we started this process. The idea is still that we create government entities and agencies and we authorize them to exist, and it's really our responsibility in the legislature to do the oversight to make sure that they're still necessary, that they're running as efficiently and effectively as they can. Ideally, the policy committees would all do that, but they are incredibly busy with new ideas. So it is helpful to have a Sunset Review Committee that can ask those fundamental questions, the same questions of all of our government agencies. Are you being as efficient and effective as you can? And certainly to do those reviews periodically. But I have to admit, it is very difficult to be first in line for that process. And so I really want to thank the board for allowing staff to come to their meetings and to really work with them on coming up with this first draft report and staff recommendations on changes that would be helpful for the Board of Pilot Commissioners to consider, and certainly for the legislature to look at. And that's the purpose of our hearing today, to kind of go through what we found, what staff found, to go through the other background information from the State Auditor's Office, and to talk about some of the recommendations with the board and have a real public discussion about whether those are good ideas, whether they disagree with those ideas, and really take some public comment, and then come back, and anything that is discussed as a result of this hearing, that we would come back and have votes of the committee on adopting those recommendations or not, and if bills are necessary to run those bills through the legislative process. So that's the goal of today's hearing. I do want to make sure that I introduce one of our new staff members. We were just a staff of one, but we now have Malcolm McClashland as one of our new committee staff to help do some of the investigative work and report writing that we do with the committee. So if you haven't had a chance to meet him, please do. A little housekeeping before we start the rest of the committee hearing. We were scheduled to review the new motor vehicle board on March 6th, but due to some scheduling requirements of the caucuses, we will have to reschedule that, and because the membership will not be available. So just check the website. I do want to make sure that folks know that the self-report for the Board of Pilot Commissioners and the staff report is available on the committee website. I checked this morning and it's up there already at sunsetreview.assembly.ca.gov. So you should be able to find, if you can't get handouts here in the committee today, you should be able to find those easily online. And with that, I'm just going to get a move on, and if we have other committee members come, we'll have them acknowledged at that time. But with that, I want to welcome our first presenters, Elaine Howell and Laura Bohl from the Bureau of State Audits. The BSA completed the first audit of the Board of Pilot Commissioners in 2009, and we'll briefly review their findings for the committee. Thank you.
Find my presentation here. Thank you, Madam Chair, Assemblymember Cook. For the record, my name is Elaine Howell. I'm the California State Auditor. To my right is my colleague, Laura Bohl. Laura was the project manager on this particular project. So when we get to tough questions, she can handle those. But what I thought I would do is go through a high-level overview of the audit. We issued the audit report in November of 2009. The audit was triggered by legislation that was enacted subsequent to the Costco Busan incident in the Bay Area that occurred at least a year or so earlier than that. There were a couple of bills enacted that dealt with the board, but also required my office to go in and do a comprehensive audit. So I'm going to go through some of the key findings and then report out on a few of the recommendations that we made to the board. We made numerous recommendations, as was indicated in the staff report. But the first finding was related to the licensing practices, and overall we felt that the board was not consistently adhering to requirements in state law. Various things. One very important requirement is that pilots actually undergo a physical examination prior to becoming licensed, and then on an annual basis after that. And as we discuss in the report, physical examinations are very important because the nature of the work that pilots are expected to do is both physical and mentally challenging. So there are very specific standards that pilots need to meet, so these physical examinations are really important. But what we found is we looked at 7 pilots who were actually seeking their first license and determining whether or not they had had a physical exam prior to receiving that license. And we identified 3 for which the board had issued a license prior to that individual receiving a physical examination, which is a problem. And in fact, one of those pilots actually had piloted vessels 18 times prior to receiving that physical exam. So that was a concern for us. We found similar concern with some pilots who were renewing their license, where we had at least one instance of 7 additional pilots that we looked at that had not had that physical examination. In addition to that, as I indicated, the board had 2 kind of dual practices. For pilots who were over the age of 50, they did require an annual examination, but what state law said is every pilot needed to be examined every year. So they had conflicting regulations. It was contrary to state law. It's my understanding they are in the process of fixing that, or perhaps already have. But again, that was a concern. There was inconsistency in making sure that pilots received an annual physical examination. And as I said earlier, very specific reasons for that because of the nature of what they are expected to do. In addition to that, the last piece on licensing is the physicians themselves. The board actually has a responsibility to formally appoint those physicians, and the reason for that is the physicians need to understand the specific standards by which they should be examining an individual to determine whether or not they are physically fit to pilot vessels in the various areas, in the various bays that they're responsible for. So we identified some pilots who actually had a physical examination, but it was done by a physician who had not been appointed by the board. So again, a concern that these physicians may have done a good job, but the board needs to make sure that they're formally appointed so that the board has assurance that these physicians are conducting the examination to make sure that the individuals who are licensed meet the standards that are expected of pilots. So those were the main concerns related to licensing. Moving on, we looked at investigations. So if there's an incident, the board has what's called an incident review committee. That committee is made up of 3 public members of the board and the executive director. And what this incident review committee is required to do is to report back to the board a completed investigation within 90 days. If they need more than 90 days, they need to ask for an extension. What we found is we looked at 24 incidents, and we found that 17 of those actually did require an extension, but not all of those received an extension prior to the 90-day window. We had a couple where there was an extension had not been granted. And again, this is important because the board needs to understand the nature of the investigation, why they need more than 90 days, because the intent is to try to get that investigation resolved relatively quickly. In addition to that, at the time we conducted the audit, they had 3 investigators under contract with the board, but what the board had not done, and again it's required by law, they had not adopted specific regulations identifying the minimum qualifications that they were looking for in an investigator. And again, similar to physical examinations, you want an investigator who meets the requirements in state law so that you have confidence that that investigator is conducting an investigation in accordance with statute, but also is going to provide the board the information they need to determine any action they need to take relative to that particular incident. The Costco Busan incident, you may recall, there were issues with the pilot related to some medications that that individual was on. So again, it's very important for this incident review committee to get their work done, or to let the board know they need more time, and then actually provide a justification, because that was another issue that we identified. Is they may have asked for an extension of the 90-day period, but we didn't see evidence of specific reasons why they felt they needed that extension of time. So another concern we raised in the report. The last thing related to investigations is, the last issue we had is the board had not complied with law regarding inspections of pilot boarding equipment. So this is equipment where the pilot goes out on a pilot boat and then has to transfer, using a ladder or other equipment, onto the vessel that they're going to pilot in and out of the bay. And in response to some reported complaints about the issues with some of that equipment, the board did not comply with law in making sure that there were inspections done. And this is a major safety issue with regard to pilot equipment, pilot ladders in particular. So we were not seeing compliance there relative to that. So that was another concern that we raised relative to investigations, and the board doing its due diligence to make sure that incidents were investigated and the equipment problems were dealt with quickly. The next area we looked at was training. So that we were looking at making sure that pilots are completing the required training and within specified time frames. What state law requires is that training be completed every 3 years. So they have refresher training with regard to their responsibilities for piloting vessels in and out of these different bays. But what we found was the board was in the process of modifying their procedures to switch from a 3-year window to a 5-year window. So we identified a few pilots that actually had not met that 3-year responsibility. The 3-year was in statute. The board was in the process of proposing regulations to broaden that to 5 years, or lengthen that to 5 years. So a couple of pilots didn't meet the 3-year window. So we said, you need to stick to the statutory requirement until you are able to, if you intend to modify that and change it to 5 years. So we had a couple of pilots that had not received the training within the 3-year window. In addition to that, one of the requirements, again, it's all in state law, it's the Harbors and Navigations Code, is that when an individual pilot goes through a training program, that training provider should provide an evaluation back to the board as to, Elaine went through the training, she had to take all these different tests, and this is how she performed. And when we spoke with the board president, the board had not received any evaluations. Those contracted vendors that were providing the training were not doing those evaluations, not providing it back to the board. So again, another statutory responsibility that we felt was very, very important, because the training is important, but you need to know how well the pilots are performing when they go through that specific training. So that was another concern that we had. Excuse me. The last area in the first section of the audit report was related to the number of pilots. State law requires the board, it doesn't have a specific number, it just says that the board needs to appoint and license enough pilots to carry out their responsibilities in law, to have enough to pilot these vessels in and out of the bays. In 2002, the board determined 60 pilots would be sufficient. They reaffirmed that in 2008. And we didn't really raise a concern about that. But what we were concerned about is, in looking at the pilots and determining those who would be eligible to retire by January of 2010, there were several pilots who would be, we identified 10 pilots. So do they have enough essentially in the queue to make sure that they continue to have sufficient pilots? Because the training program for a new pilot is very extensive. It can take from 1 up to 3 years. And if you have 10 or so pilots who are eligible to retire, it doesn't mean they all will retire, but you need to be prepared for the event that several of those individuals retire. You have to have others, basically succession planning, to put it in another way, to make sure that you're kind of tracking how many pilots you currently have licensed, what the expectations are as far as much longer those individuals are going to work, and do you have individuals in the training program so they'll be able to step up and take over when you have pilots retiring. So we had some specific recommendations related to that. Now, the second chapter of the audit report, we just had a few issues. One issue was related to confidential information. As I said, we did a comprehensive audit, but we were looking at how well the board was protecting confidential information, not only of pilots, but of board members and others. And what we found is that the board did not have specific procedures, even though, again, they were required by state law that was enacted in January of 2009, required the board to develop specific procedures for providing access to information and protecting confidential information. When we looked in September, we issued our report in November, at that point in time they had not yet developed procedures. And we actually, during the course of the audit, identified at least one instance where confidential information was provided to an external organization. So we certainly had concerns about that. The other issue was personal and confidential information from not only pilots but board members, et cetera, kept in cabinets. They were unlocked cabinets. And the reason we had concerns is the board has meetings. Well, they're public meetings. Those cabinets could easily have been accessed by members of the public based on the location of those individual files. So again, we had some concerns about protection of confidential information. Other administrative processes we looked at, the Political Reform Act, as far as filing statements of economic interest, determining whether the board was making sure that members of the board were filing their statements of economic interest and retaining those on file. And we found that they were not maintaining copies of those. In addition, they were not, at that time, requiring investigators to file statements of economic interest, and we felt that was important. Those investigators had a very specific role, very important role in evaluating incidents, so we felt that investigators needed to file those statements of economic interest as well. And we found some instances. We looked at some board members, we looked at some staff, and found a few instances. We looked at 12 people and found 4 where they did not have records of their statements of economic interest, and none of the investigators were required to file those forms. In addition, there are specific requirements, as I'm sure you're aware, that state officials have to receive ethics training, both in orientation as a new board member and then on a biennial basis. We're all required to have ethics training. At that point, they had not provided that type of training. And again, when we were conducting the audit back in 2009, they had just begun a process to provide training on ethics. And the reason that we felt that was really important, we actually identified an issue where it was a former executive director who had received basically a gift of public funds, a free parking in San Francisco for a period of time. We referred that issue to FPPC. They actually did investigate it, find the individual, and it's my understanding from Laura when we met yesterday that individual, that former executive director, did pay the fine. So it's just an example that we had in the report of why it's important for board members and staff to understand Political Reform Act and what their responsibilities are and what they should and shouldn't do with respect to their responsibilities as members of the board or members of the executive team or staff. Another issue that we looked at is related to pilotage rates and determining whether or not the board is actually approving rates. I mean, the legislature certainly has a role in establishing those rates, but there are various rates that the vessels are charged, and they provide support for various. There's rates for pension, there's rates for training, there are some other surcharges that are applied. But what we found is the board was approving these rates. Actually, the board was not approving. The rates were changing, and the formal board had not approved those rates, and that is a process that needs to happen. In addition to that, there are specific requirements to have annual audits of those different surcharges, both the pension surcharge and the pilot boat surcharge, which is another surcharge that is charged to these vessels so that the Board of Pilots can maintain their pilot boats that go out to bring the pilot out to transfer onto the vessel that they're going to pilot into the bay. So there needed to be annual audits, and that was not occurring. There had been audits previous, a few years before, but those need to be happening on an annual basis so they can account for the funds that they are collecting. The other issue was there's an inland pilot who deals with the ports of Sacramento and I think West Sacramento and Stockton, and that individual was not charging the training surcharge. He misunderstood the requirements, should have been charging that, had not been, so we pointed that out to the board as well, and it's my understanding that that's been corrected. Just a couple of more things. And then two other issues related to administrative responsibilities, contracts. They needed to have, again, this is back to the physicians, they didn't have written contracts with some of their physicians, and they needed to do that to make sure that the physician understood what his or her responsibilities were, and the board could lay out in that contract what the expectation was. So we felt that was a very necessary process that the board needed to engage in. And then the last staff talked about in her analysis is related to travel expenses. We identified that they were traveling business class, and we felt that there were opportunities for them to use less expensive airfare to travel, particularly when they were flying to France for some of the training that the pilots were receiving in France. There's also training that they attended in Baltimore, but our concern was we felt that there would be opportunity for them to save the state or save some money with regard to the cost of those travel to those training events. We made a lot of recommendations, as staff indicated, about 27 recommendations. I'm just going to go through a very high level of the things that the board has done. In a nutshell, the board has taken quite a bit of action relative to our recommendations. At the 1-year point, out of 27 recommendations, we felt that they had implemented 20. Which, for an entity that it seems like had not been audited in the past and certainly had not been audited by us, that's prompt response compared to what we see with other departments. We have a follow-up process after the 1 year. If there are still recommendations outstanding, we reach out to that entity and ask them specifically about those recommendations. For the 7 that were still outstanding, they had fully implemented 5 more. So we're down to a couple of recommendations, and I'll talk about those in specifics. But I want to just go through a few high-level items with regard to actions the board has taken that we were pleased to see. They actually completed some regulatory process last year with regard to the frequency of the physical examinations to make sure that those are happening on an annual basis. They've developed a written protocol for access to confidential information, so we believe that they've addressed that concern that we had. With regard to statements of economic interest, they've developed a checklist and now have a process for assuring that individuals are submitting those statements of economic interest, and we would expect that someone's reviewing those because that's an important part of the process as well. They've developed a new process for the board to actually approve any changes in pilotage rates. With regard to statements of economic interest, let me go back real quick. They are now requiring investigators to submit those statements of economic interest, so again, that's an improvement. They have contracted with an accounting firm for the annual audits that we suggested, and they actually are asking that firm to go back to 2009 and conduct audits, so to bring them up current. As I indicated, the inland pilot is now charging the training surcharge. They are looking at the travel. I know there are some concerns that the committee has relative to that as far as the refundable versus non-refundable tickets. We didn't get into that in the audit, but certainly they asserted to us that they are going to try to use the most cost-effective, most economical travel. And then 2 others that I wanted to mention. They have implemented a process to track investigations. They have documentation now. They've asserted in their board minutes with regard to the request for an extension, why an extension was granted, the reasons for that. And then they also have adopted regulations that were approved by OAL this last year, back in March of 2011, with regard to minimum qualifications for investigators. So they have gone through the regulatory process for certain items or certain specific recommendations that we had. The 2 recommendations that are still outstanding are with regard to, again, physical examinations. The first one is making sure that they consistently adhere to requirements in state law when licensing pilots and should establish and implement a procedure for approving and monitoring board-appointed physicians. It's our understanding from the response we got from our follow-up inquiry for those recommendations that were still outstanding is they're in the process, again, of going through the regulatory developing regulations, but I'll defer to the board with regard to what the status is of that. Our understanding is that their intent is to have that completed by June of 2013. But I think they can give you more specifics on what they've done so far. The other one is similar, is to ensure that its expenditures are appropriate. They should competitively bid contracts with physicians to make sure that they are establishing contracts with physicians who can meet the expectations, and certainly at a most cost-effective way for the board to bring those physicians under contract. And it's my understanding they engaged in having University of California conduct a study for them, received recommendations from that, and again, I think it's my understanding from their response to us recently that they are also going to undergo the regulatory process with regard to that, and that also would be completed by June of 2013. So I will defer to the board with regard to any additional activity that's occurred related to that. So that is kind of a somewhat high-level overview of the issues we identified in the report and the status of the various recommendations that we made. But as I indicated, we, based on the amount of time that has transpired and the number of recommendations, we were quite pleased to see the response that the board provided to us and the actions they've taken.
Thank you very much. I want to first acknowledge the addition to our committee of Assembly Members Olson and Dickinson and Gordon and Senators Emerson and our Vice Chair, Gloria Negrete-McLeod. Thank you all for joining us. I don't think we quite have a quorum yet, so we're still waiting for that, but I see questions already from Assemblymember Cook.
Yeah, the trip to Europe caught my attention. Germany and Rome, and I'm saying, why in God's name do you have to go there for pilot training? And years ago, I know they used to do extensive pilot training in New Orleans because of all the barges and liners and everything else that came up the Mississippi. In fact, the military was actually sending pilots down there, I thought. And it just seems like you got to go all the way over there to train, and to the public, perception is reality. Kind of looks like it just doesn't look good. Did you notice that at all, or I know she didn't comment on it, but.
Well, we certainly didn't. I mean, we looked at it from the perspective of the cost efficiency, not the decision to obtain training in France. But we certainly made suggestions to them to try to contain those costs, particularly from the perspective of flying business class as opposed to economy or whatever it's called. But there also are indications, and I think staff referred to it in her analysis, that the board had moved forward with essentially similar to what we were suggesting on the physicians, going out with a competitive bidding process to determine who else is available out there to provide that type of training, and do we really need to go to Europe, or could we receive that type of training the pilots need in the United States, which would be much more cost efficient and effective. But we specifically did not look at that process because that was subsequent to the audit as far as how they went about that.
And I'm sure we'll have the board able to comment directly on that. But Senator Emerson.
Thank you. I came in a little late, and I apologize, but there was no mention of any evaluation or audit with respect to the pension plans. Did you take a look at their pension situation?
Well, we didn't specifically, and Laura can help me on this, but we didn't specifically evaluate their pension. We certainly looked at the number of pilots that they have, what their pension eligibility is, and then looked to determine how many of the, at that time, 56 pilots would be eligible to retire relatively soon. But we did not evaluate, and Laura can correct me if I'm wrong, the structure of their pension system and the nature of what the pilots would need to do to qualify for a pension.
So we do not know if it's a fully funded pension and they're in relatively good shape?
We didn't do that type of analysis, no.
Thank you. Can I just ask you on the competitive bidding, because I think that was an additional concern that staff had when they looked at it. Can you give a little details, and maybe Laura can do this better, on how the bids should be structured and whether or not you think that they're complying with current law on competitive bidding?
Did we look at competitive bidding?
No, it was a recommendation.
Yeah, we made a recommendation, Ms. Huber, in the report. We didn't specific because at that point they weren't contracting out. When we look at contracting practices, you want to see an RFP that's pretty specific on what the expectations are. What are we looking for with regard to physicians? So when you're putting the RFP out, you want to make sure that you lay out so the individuals who are bidding on that RFP are trying to obtain the contract know what the expectations are. Now, one of the situations, and there was a discussion in the staff analysis, is what you have to be careful about is you can't develop those specifications to the point where you're precluding certain individuals from being able to bid on that particular RFP. We've had situations in our investigative shop in the office where we have looked at processes where RFPs were designed so specifically that only one particular vendor could meet the qualifications, and that's a problem. Because you have to have, if that's the case, then why didn't you just go out with a sole source contract and do a sole source justification for it? So I think in looking at, if we were to evaluate in the future, we would really take a hard look at the RFP, the contracting practice, to make sure that if you felt that these were specifications that were necessary to be in the RFP, prove to us why you felt those needed to be in there. Is it in statute? Is it in your regulations? Why was it so important for a particular vendor to have that type of qualification? So I don't know if that helps.
It does, and I think it helps for framing part of the discussion with the board later, so thank you. Assemblymember Olson.
I kind of want to take a step back because I'm still learning the industry, so I want to make sure that the premises I'm operating under are correct and not inaccurate. But these are private employees, right? These are not, there's no state taxpayer funds involved in salary or training or anything like that? That's correct. Okay. Then it just seems odd to me, and perhaps there are other examples where we are involved and I just don't understand that clearly, but it seems odd to me that the state would be so heavily involved in having jurisdiction over where they receive training, what kind of pensions they receive, any of those things. It just seems that the opportunity for that would be at the negotiating table with the shippers, between the shippers and the bar pilots. So can you explain to me a little bit why the state is as involved as it is? Because we as individuals may think, you know, why in the world do they need to go to Europe for training? But I don't really see what jurisdiction we have over those decisions if they don't involve taxpayer dollars.
Well, I think part of it is the statutes that were enacted recently after I think what triggered some of this is the Costco Busan incident in San Francisco, and making sure the state legislature, administration having a responsibility through our state oil spill office to make sure that if an incident like that occurs, that's dealt with. But I think, and again, it's somewhat speculative on my part because I don't know what the policy decision was, is that the state needed to have some role. Certainly members of the board, some are appointed by the governor, some are public members. They are, I think a couple are pilots. So I think when the legislation was enacted subsequent to that incident to move the board under Business Transportation and Housing, the state wasn't necessarily trying to take over but provide some structure relative to some of the concerns that were identified during the audit we did and when the spill occurred. And then this audit, seeing that there were not a lot of administrative controls and there just wasn't a lot of structure. I mean, I understand where you're coming from because you're absolutely right. The majority of, or maybe all of, I think all of the support for the board and the pilots is based on these surcharges I was referring to. There's several different surcharges, and that's what supports their operations, supports their pension program, supports making sure that their equipment is maintained, the pilot boats that go out and the equipment, and all of that. So I don't specifically have an answer for you, but I think some of this was triggered by the incident that occurred in San Francisco.
Okay, I just want to make sure, because Sunset Review in part is about making sure that our agencies, boards, and commissions don't experience mission creep over the years or decades that they've been in existence. And it seems most of our licensing boards in California are just that, licensing boards. And it appears, although I understand it's really hard to determine what the intent was when they were first created, especially one that was in the 1800s. Right. But it just seems that perhaps this is an example where we've had some mission creep by the commission, and they're involved in matters that ordinarily a state commission wouldn't be involved in. But thank you.
Thank you. I think that's actually a really good discussion for the policy committees. And one of the things, as chair of the Sunset Review Committee, that I'm trying to make sure that we do is not go too much into the question of whether the legislature made a good policy decision in deciding to, for example, here we have a state-sanctioned monopoly. I mean, that's really what it is. But the board was created in 1850, and that was part of the policy decision then. And there are different models in different harbors and ports throughout the country. We certainly have a lot of public employees operating as pilots down in Southern California, and they are still part of a government entity. There are very few models that is 100% private. But by creating, it's ultimately a user fee-based system, right? So it is a state-sanctioned monopoly, but it's regulated and paid for by the industry. It's regulated by the state, but paid for by the industry, and it's part of the reason why we have an interest in making sure that the industry isn't being overcharged, and is certainly that the board is operating in an efficient and effective manner, but not asking the fundamental question, the policy question, as the Sunset Review Committee, but really saying once the policy's decided that we are going to have a state-run monopoly in the Bay Area on pilot commissioners, and that there's a public need for that, and there's public safety reasons why we're doing that, are they being efficient and effective in carrying out that mission? And I think that's really what we tried to focus on for the staff reports. Senator Emerson.
I have a follow-up question since we've gotten into the area of quasi-government and quasi-private relationships here. Are they covered under the PERS system for their retirement?
Do you know?
No, they are not.
They are not?
They are not. Okay.
Any other questions from members? If you wouldn't mind sticking around, we may have some after we have representatives from the board. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, members.
Thank you. And members, you all have behind tab 1 in your binder the staff background paper, which has some of the issues that staff followed up having the benefit of the BSA audit, and some of the new issues that weren't covered in the BSA audit, but are recommendations that staff was asking us as a committee to take action on. We're going to allow the board to talk about some of those recommendations and give their opinion on whether we should or shouldn't do particular recommendations from the staff report. And from the Board of Pilot Commissioners, we have Alan Garfinkel, the executive director, who's I think been about 2 years now almost as the executive director, Michael Miller, the board president, and Barbara Price, a member of the Pilot Fitness Committee. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. I thank the chair. As the chair said, I'm Mike Miller, and I have been an appointed member of the Board of Pilot Commissioners since August of 2005. About a year and a half later, on the theory that no good deed goes unpunished, I was elected by my colleagues to be president of the board. They have elected me twice more, and I will continue to serve until I am termed out as a commissioner, and that will be at the end of this year. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to appear before you. I think that the review process, both the audit that BSA conducted and the review that you are conducting, is very helpful to us. And I want to spend a moment, and then I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues, to say how I view the BSA audit and recommendations. 6 years ago, I walked into, I won't say it was a broken commission, but I will say it had a lot of problems. To use the nautical expression, it was taken on water fast. And the BSA audit recommendations was a roadmap for us. It gave us specific things that needed to get fixed as quickly as we could do it. And we have moved ahead with all deliberate speed on that. The process that we've gone through with you, the chair, and staff, has similarly been helpful. It's given us focus on things that we need to address and do so as quickly as we can. The two items that are still being worked on, both in the medical fitness area, are ones that our colleague Barbara Price will speak to. The other progress that we have made during his tenure and prior to it, Captain Garfinkel will speak to. Let me just say a few things about my colleagues. Captain Garfinkel went to the California is a graduate of the California Maritime Academy. He sailed for 30 years, 22 of those for the Matson Navigation Company. He sailed on 10 of the vessels in their fleet, 9 of them as the ship's captain. He came ashore 2 years ago in 15 days. We are very fortunate to have him. Many, many good things have happened on his watch. Barbara Price is president of PK Consulting in Alameda. She is also the vice president of the Board of Trustees of the Alameda County Medical Center. She has served on our Pilot Fitness Committee through its entire tenure, through the process of working with the University of California San Francisco Medical Center in developing the 107-page study report that they provided to us, and is now very active in the process of further developing the ideas that were inherent in the recommendations of that report. So with that, I would turn it over to Captain Garfinkel.
Thank you, President Miller, and Madam Chair, thank you for inviting us up here, and all the members of the committee. I'm relatively new to the state process. As Mike pointed out, I've been with the board 2 years, and it's been a very interesting and challenging 2 years. I want to say that the board it appears to me to have come a long way in the time that I've been with them. With the audit just came out prior to my coming on board with the board. It came out in November of 2009, and I joined in February 2010. Everyone was still a bit new to the process of trying to implement all the audit's recommendations. At the risk of sounding like an Academy Award acceptance speech, I think that there's some people that should be acknowledged before I begin into my formal remarks. Certainly Mike Miller, the president of the board, who has been instrumental in bringing this board into the in modern times. Since we've been under BT&H, very key figure has been Deputy General Counsel Gabor Maros, who's been very active, and indeed after the previous executive director resigned, Counsel Maros was the acting executive director for a period of time. And certainly all the volunteers, the hardworking commissioners that get the work done, the grunt work done in the committee level have to be thanked, including Barbara Price and all the members of the fitness committee. And I want to point out that all the board members are volunteers. They get a small bit of pay, $600 a month for the public members, but the rest are all volunteers. And they've worked incredibly hard to implement the BSA audit recommendations. So I came aboard in 2010. The audit was just published. I think I'd just like to point out some key things that happened since I've been here. We administered a selection exam for new pilots. I know that the auditors talked about having pilots in the queue for retirements. It's a very difficult process, and to estimate when pilots are going to retire. They have no obligation to say to give us a firm date. We conduct retirement surveys twice a year, which we ask the pilots what their intentions are. But of the 56 pilots responding each time, it's very difficult to juggle the 1 to 3 year process that it takes to make a new pilot, and that includes a selection exam. We administered a selection exam 6 months after I came aboard in 2010. In June of 2010, we had 52 applicants to take that exam. 32 of them qualified. Of that 32, 22 passed the written exam, and of that 22 who passed the written exam, they were qualified to take a simulator exam, and of that 22, only 12 made it onto the list. Now that list of 12 people goes from 1 to 3 years, or up to 3 years, And in that time, when the board sees a need to bring more trainees into the program, then they'll ask trainees from this list to join the training program, which also can take up to 3 years. In that time, these applicants are leaving generally very high-paying maritime jobs and going into a training program where they're going to maybe be 3 years on income of $5,000 a month or $60,000 a year, which is a big sacrifice for a lot of these people, especially if they have families. So the board has to juggle this time frame where they've got three-year program. These people are in training. You don't know when they'll complete the program. It varies from person to person, how quickly they assimilate the information that they need, and the pilot evaluation committee feels they're ready to go. And so we do our best to try to keep that pipeline full without overdoing it. If there aren't openings in the program, it's possible, or I'm not in the program, but if there are no pilots retiring, it's possible we could have trainees term out at 3 years and not have an opening in the pilot association. And here they've sacrificed 3 years of their career training, and they may have nowhere to go, no job to go to. So that's a consideration that the board has to look at in not bringing too many trainees in to the program when we don't have the openings. So it's a very difficult balancing act. So we conducted a selection exam. As the auditors point out, we've done numerous rulemaking. One of them concerned the portable pilot unit or laptop computer. This was a recommendation that came out of the COSCO Busan, and the board has acted upon it, and now the pilots carry a laptop computer that is an independent navigation tool which enables them to draw on information from the independent of most of the ship's systems, although they do use what's called the AIS, or Automatic Information System, that's run by the Coast Guard. So there's rulemaking on the laptops, rulemaking on annual physical exams, investigator services, that's what the auditor spoke of contracting with investigators, conflict of interest code, we implemented rulemaking on that, and changes to the incident review process. We also created a new website to keep stakeholders involved, and on that website we continually publish information that we feel will be of value to the public. I've worked with the Pilot Fitness Committee to create this study, of which Ms. Barbara Price will speak to a little later. This was a study with UC Med Center where we contracted with them to provide a study on pilot fitness overview and what was really important to look at in the pilot fitness realm. And they completed the study, and it was accepted by the board with 20 recommendations. And if the board implements them all, it'll be a really groundbreaking study. It is a groundbreaking study, but it will be groundbreaking rulemaking, which the entire nation is looking to as a role model for further action on their part. So it's important to recognize that this commission has been in the forefront of pilot fitness and generally in pilot rulemaking. We also held rate hearings in 2011. That took place over several days. That resulted in a recommendation to the legislature. In my tenure, we also oversaw the move of the board offices from Pier 9 to a new location on Davis Street, provided better conditions for the staff, and less of an appearance of we were in the same pier as the pilot office, and it just was not good optics. And then I think no discussion of my 2 years here is complete without talking about some of the staffing challenges that the board has faced in the time that I've been here. I joined in February 2010. At that time, there were 3 employees, full-time employees of the board, an assistant director appointed by the governor, myself, selected by the board, the commission, and a staff service analyst. Shortly after I joined, 18 days to be exact, the assistant director went out on maternity leave, and shortly after that, the staff service analyst resigned to go into public service, or private service, excuse me. For 5 months, I pretty much ran the board solo, and that was an interesting challenge. In that time, I got the selection exam prepared and held the selection exam, and various rulemaking was going on. And of course, we hold monthly meetings and committee meetings several times a month. So that was an interesting time for me. And then during that time, we also lost the services of a gentleman who had been board counsel for 25 years. This was a significant loss because it really resulted in a loss of institutional memory. I was new and running solo. The commissioners had some institutional memory, but their longest term is 8 years. So there really was no institutional memory to fall back on. And that had good aspects and bad aspects because there really was no procedures in place to fall back on. So we had to develop procedures from scratch, which the BSA audit was instrumental in helping us do. But the reason we lost this institutional memory, a gentleman who had been board counsel for 25 years had been each year we had to ask permission from the Attorney General's office to hire this gentleman because it's outside counsel. And finally in June 2010 they said, no, you can rely on the staff of the Attorney General's office. We have very competent board counsel. I don't have any problems with that, but moreover, it was the institutional memory, the history of where the board had been and what procedures were in place, if any, prior to my coming aboard. So that was a significant event also. And then finally we were able to hire a new staff service analyst, and then the legislature gave us the permission to hire an office technician as well. And during this time, since the original assistant director who was appointed by Governor Schwarzenegger resigned in June of 2010, we have not had another assistant director in place. Now legislation has been passed, AB 1025, that allows BT&H to appoint that assistant director, and so we're hoping to see one soon. So we've never had a staff of 4, even though the report alludes to that. Sometimes down to a staff of 1, and more often for the past year a staff of 3. And I've got to thank my staff services analyst who has been working at the level of an assistant director the entire time he's been there, and my office technician who's been working as a staff service analyst for the entire time she's been there. So it's been challenging, but it's never dull.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I want to make sure that we get to Ms. Price.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Members of the committee, Chair. I'm Barbara Price, and I'd like to say our other committee members were a whopping committee of 3. Our chair of our committee is Captain Steve Roberts, who is here today, who is also a bar pilot commissioner and is captain. And then we have General Chester L. Ward, who is also a doctor, Brigadier General, Master Flight Surgeon, Medical Corps, U.S. Army, retired. I have to read that, otherwise I always get it wrong. I just call him Dr. General. So the committee, a little bit about who I am. I actually, as Vice President of the Alameda County Medical Center Board of Trustees, we're a large medical center for Alameda County. We are the safety net operation. We're the trauma center. I joined that board 9 years ago when that organization was ready to close, and was part of the turnaround team taking an organization that had huge problems, where we ended up, a few of us, kind of running as the exec team for a while until we were able to rebuild the system. And we're now a very successful system and actually making money and doing well. And my expertise is governance and quality assurance. So I have chaired the quality committee for the Board of Trustees for 9 years, and making sure that when we're looking at physician oversight and the type of product that we deliver, that it's the right one. So I bring that to this organization, and coming in at a time when looking at how the physicians were interacting, what was going on, and then starting this whole process. We feel comfortable, the committee, that we did a full job review. We understand what the job is about. We were offered the opportunity to board a ship and ride it with a pilot in very calm waters, not off the gate, which at my age was interesting. But I learned a lot, and it was a lot understanding that people have to understand how these people do their job. So with the work with our partner, the UCSF, we feel that we put together a very comprehensive program that really changes the way that the pilot fitness will be overseen. It's very hands-on, creating a methodology that allows for a medical surveillance program versus just a person coming in once a year for a physical exam and saying, you know, you're here, you're there, you're great. This actually provides the board with a medical review officer that will keep the board up to date on current physical and mental surveillance type of products, and hopefully work with the pilots so that we're looking at pilots and actually know where they stand physically and mentally and their level of fatigue and their ability to serve on a regular basis. So that's really where we are. As my colleague said, we have 20 recommendations. I am working as part of the fitness committee. We are now working with the regulations committee, which is headed also by one of the commissioners who is also a captain, and David Wainwright, who's also here. And we're going through the very, very painful process of writing what we hope are very good, solid legislative recommendations that puts this type of a product into effect with the intent that we have spent the last 3 years putting together, which is full, active, hands-on oversight of the fitness and moving forward for the fitness requirements in the industry in a way that it can be done, can be monitored, and can be measured.
Great, thank you. Any questions for the board and the members? Senator Negrete-McLeod.
I understand why you have to have some mental fitness because of what happened with the, with the Busan issue, but I would think that just the job itself entailed that the pilots have to be fit as a general course because that is their job. That and you couldn't have a 350-pound guy trying to climb the ropes just because the job wouldn't allow you to do it. I mean, your own physical fitness to be able to get up to a ship. And so I would think that fitness, physical fitness, aside of everything else, that the job entails that somebody has to be fit in order to fit that job. Am I correct?
Yes, and one of the things that we have found is that there's, as you well know, there are lots of very fit-looking people who are not quite fit. And the thing that we want to make sure, of course, no, not this group. All pictures of health. But what we're looking for is what we don't see. The pilot that may have a heart condition and doesn't know it or doesn't want to talk about it. Sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is something that is very common. So you've got somebody running up and down the sides of a ship. They may be fine, they think. We want to make sure that what we see on the inside matches what we're seeing on the outside.
Senator Emerson.
Thank you. Mr. Garfinkel, I was wondering if you could give me some idea about the competitiveness of the rates from various ports around in the United States to where you would fit into that picture. Are you higher than, lower than, or in the median, or how would you characterize your rates?
I really haven't done any comparison studies of the rates of different pilot jurisdictions around the country, so I couldn't give you a background on that. I'm sorry.
So how do you determine the rate structure that you charge?
The rate structure is decided by the legislature. The board gives recommendations to the legislature, and the legislature sets the bar pilotage rate.
So more directly, you're actually, because believe me, we wouldn't have a clue what that would be, so we'd have to take that information from you. I'm an orthodontist by profession, so I would, you'd find out that your structure would be a little skewed there. But how do you make that recommendation to us?
Well, the most recent rate hearings took place over 4 days, and were widely, they drew upon a wide variety of stakeholders. Notice was given to as wide of spectrum of the industry as we could gather in, and we rented a large auditorium in Oakland at the State Building and held open public hearings on the rates. And industry brought in economists and experts to testify on their side. The pilots brought in experts to testify. The board sat and listened to all the relevant arguments, and then held hearings where they debated the various merits, tried to use their best estimate of what the economy would do in the scope of that rate adjustment, and came up with a recommendation.
Thank you.
And we will be having a speaker from the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association that can chime in on the rates. Any other questions for the board? I do want to ask about the competitive bidding process, because one of the things that we notice on the staff level is, for example, the training facility in Europe, that if you do a competitive bid for training of pilots, but you structure it that it can only be someone that has a certification that is a training facility in Europe, then you're really not having that opportunity to competitively bid. How are you addressing those concerns raised both by the BSA audit and by the staff report?
Well, I would be Madam Chair, I'd be the one to particularly answer that question, I suppose. I have to preface it by saying I don't have state experience, so we contract with the California Highway Patrol to do our contracting administrative work. So, and there's been several contracts that we let since I joined the board, and some of them were non-competitive bids, and some of them were competitive bids. In the past, everyone seems focused on our training in France, because it's a grabber, because it's France. So I'll speak to that, but I just want to point out that there's been a whole lot of other contracts let that have gone smoothly and no issues raised. This one just seems to be a hot-button contract. The training in France, there's a well, first of all, the training is statutorily mandated. And so in order to fulfill that statutory mandate, we are looking around for the best facility we can, because you want the best training for the pilots in the Bay that you can get. In the past, they've chosen the best facility and done a non-competitive bid, and this has been not a problem. They looked at all the facilities and chose the one that best met their needs and had the best program and sent the pilots there. When we came under BT&H, we were notified that process wouldn't fly anymore, and so we tried to address the process of competitively bidding that contract. We went with an IFB, which is the invitation for bid, because we felt that we had enough particulars about the program that we didn't need to do a request for proposal, which is a more time-consuming process where you have to develop evaluation points and such. There are only 6 facilities worldwide that offer this kind of man model training. 2 are in the United States, 1 in Massachusetts, 1 in Louisiana, 1 is in Poland, 1 is in Australia, 1 is in the United Kingdom, and 1 is in France. The French facility is the oldest and very highly respected. This is not to say that the other facilities don't have something to offer. When I came aboard, there was some discussion about sending a scout team out to the other facilities because no one had really visited the other facilities to see what they offered. Well, this in itself would have been a very controversial endeavor, sending 2 pilots or myself around the world looking at Poland and UK and Australia. I mean, that's going to raise some eyebrows, and I'm sure it would have been an issue for this commission as well. We haven't done that yet, but we did look at all the facilities and at least as much information as we could garner from them. The one in Louisiana was not operating when we let the contract. It only started offering classes again this fall, or this spring, I mean, in February. But the one in Massachusetts is a very small facility and is mostly geared to military vessels. Poland and the UK are fine facilities. We just don't know a lot about them, and the one in Australia we know even less about. We prepared the contract with specifications that we felt were necessary. The one that seems to draw a lot of attention is the Det Norske Veritas certification. And so I'd like to address that particularly. DNV is one of the world's leading classification societies. Classification Society is an organization that of marine industry and regulatory bodies that have gotten together and accumulate maritime knowledge and expertise, and they generally use their skills to classify ships. And the Coast Guard relies heavily upon classification societies to fulfill their mission. If the Coast Guard finds something wrong with the ship, they turn to the classification society and said, "Well, the repair will be done, and you gentlemen figure out if it was done to class specifications." And then the Coast Guard takes the class society's word on it. There's 13 leading classification societies in the world. One of them is Lloyd's of London. One of them is Det Norske Veritas. In the United States, it's American Bureau of Shipping. There's also Korean Register of Shipping, one in Russia, one in Japan. And DNV, or Det Norske Veritas, is just one of them. But it's a leading one, and it's been at the forefront of not only classifying ships, but classifying training to ISO standards. And so when we looked at the classification societies, we thought that having a classification society certification for the course, meaning that the course is audited, that that someone other than the course provider takes a good hard look at the course material and how the course is run, and that it meets certain quality standards. So we wrote that into the contract, that they have DNV certification. In retrospect, we should have said DNV or equivalent certification. That would have probably assuaged a lot of the concerns of this committee. My naivety, I did not have that in there, and of course the chickens have come home to roost on that issue. But I want to point out that even though the other manned model training courses may have complained that, oh, we don't have DNV certification, they didn't come forward to us and say, well, we have this certification, will that do? They just rolled over. But there's DNV certifications on courses in 15 countries around the world, a variety of courses, and even as close to home as CMA has DNV certification on their courses. So it's not something so unusual that it was put in there just to exclude bidders from the contract, if that's the committee's concern. Sorry, that's kind of a long-winded answer.
That was a very long-winded answer, but that's okay. More information is always helpful. I think what we were looking at is that complaints were made to CHP. While they had not been made directly to you, to the folks that you contract with, complaints were made there. And maybe they just didn't make you aware of that. And I know that there's other types of certifications out there. Massachusetts has USCG, and I think the or equivalent would be helpful. But that's part of the process of having this committee look at what you do and see if we can learn from the mistakes of the past and make a better, more efficient and effective agency or commission or board from this review process. So I just want to ask, if there's no other questions, I just want to ask of the board, I know that the board hasn't taken formal positions on the recommendations, but if there's anything as president of the board that is in the staff recommendations that you disagree with, I certainly want to make sure that the committee has an opportunity to hear that. Sure.
At this point in time? Sure. Number one, I think that spinning off of this conversation we just had, I think that the recommendation to hold a full-blown RFP in 2013 is exactly what we should do. Sadly, I will be turned out by the time that happens, but we can certainly put it in process. I know that I had what I consider to be a thorough knowledge of the capability of many of the other facilities, but that knowledge is a little stale, so it's time to get current. And I think that process with enough lead time, because the RFP, and I have to say that the folks at California Highway Patrol, as much as I admire them, they were kind of overwhelmed with what this little commission needed from them, and we were up against a time warp. So, but we'll get that straightened out. I don't have all of the recommendations here in front of me, but let me address a couple of them. One is the recommendation to follow the National Transportation Safety Board recommendation to the governors that we establish hours of service rules. And I speak only for myself. I'm not speaking for the board. The board has not taken a position. I certainly don't speak for BT&H or anybody else. This is just Mike Miller. There's no free lunch there. It seems easy, but when you really parse it, having a rigid rule, and let's just say 12 hours and it's drop dead, okay? If you only have 11 hours and 59 minutes of rest, you can't pilot that ship. You can set up a system like that, but we actually, Alan and I, several months ago, were invited by Captain Cynthia Stowe, who is the captain of the port for the U.S. Coast Guard. She is the commander of all Coast Guardsmen in San Francisco Bay and related waters. And she invited us over to Yerba Buena Island to sit down with her chief of staff and another senior staff member on her staff and introduce ourselves, the usual get acquainted kind of a conversation. In that process, I had just returned a few weeks before from the NTSB meeting at which the Eagle Otomi allision and collision in the waterway to the port of Port Arthur, Texas, had been reviewed, and I knew what their concerns. They had very, very strong concerns about pilot fatigue, and we have similar concerns. But I told Captain Stowe about the recommendation that was going to be forthcoming to the governors, and her staff just kind of slunk back in its chair because they knew what the collateral, if I may use such a bold expression, the collateral damage would be from that kind of an approach. It's not immediately obvious, unless, of course, you're a mariner, you're a Coast Guard, and you're interested in all the matters that pertain to safety. The problem is that you can end up with ships, pilots that are perfectly capable of piloting those ships, but are told you cannot get aboard that ship. And you have ships outside in the precautionary area that are doing donuts, sailing around, waiting for a pilot who has 12 hours off-duty time. You have ships, maybe you have ships that are moored in Oakland. They're ready to go, but they can't go. What happens? You've shut down the port. So a rigid rule is, in my view, not the best way to go. And I can't speak for the Coast Guard, but judging from that conversation, I think that if we were to, and BT&H has devolved upon us their letter and request that we review it, and of course we will do that. But I think that review is going to require liaise with the Coast Guard because they are our partners in safety, if you will, for this sort of a thing. I think that there are better ways. I mean, the goal is not to write a rule. The goal is to eliminate minimum rest period exceptions. And the term minimum rest period is actually kind of a misnomer. What it really means is a period of time not on duty. To put it in perspective, there were, in fact, 320 MRP exceptions in the last calendar year. That's out of 8,000 moves. To put it in perspective. Is one too many? Yeah, sure. But the pilots are pretty successful in having adequate rest. So the question is, well, how can we get that number of 320 down to something, that you can count on your fingers and toes? And I think that there are ways. We have our pilot fitness committee, and Barbara can speak to the preliminary work that they've been doing on pilot fatigue. The pilots themselves have established an internal committee that are working on ways that they can reorder some of their work rules and their practices so that those significant numbers are brought under control. There is a system in place in many piloted waters called callbacks, where pilots who are on their week off or 2 weeks off, whatever, however they arrange their affairs, are brought back in, and that's done locally on a voluntary basis. But there may need to be something to beef that up. My view has always been, I'd rather have the pilots figure out how it's going to work because they know their business. I'm not a mariner at all. I know a lot about their business after 5.5, 6 years, but I'd much rather have them figure out the answer, present it to the board so that we know what they're doing and we are comfortable that we're going to get those MRPs down. So on that issue, that's one of the other issue has to do, and I'll take another look at all the issues, but the other one has to do with the business class travel question. I find myself at a very awkward place. At some point, you just got to be a stand-up guy, and you got to say what you think, even if it ruffles some feathers. And what I'm going to say is going to ruffle some feathers. I think that right now our policy following on the process of the BSA audit is, in fact, to reimburse the cost of the most economical, fully refundable fare. It is a fact that those tickets cost more than a non-refundable fare. Not a huge amount, but several $1,000s more. The problem with that, now, some pilots have been able to convert those tickets into business class tickets, either because they were complimentary from the airline or perhaps they're exchangeable, whatever. And there are many things to be said about that. But the key thing is, for me, is, again, I'm more interested in policy than I am an arbitrary rule. From a policy standpoint, sending someone on a 16-hour transit through 8 time zones, sitting up in what I like to call pretzel class, in economy, guarantees that that pilot is going to be fatigued when he or she gets off the plane at the other end. Coming back, same issue, except a little more time. Going to be fatigued when that pilot gets off the plane, goes back in the rotation, and goes to work soon. That's a safety issue. To me, the outbound trip is a waste issue. The inbound is a safety issue, the return trip. You can't, and I think it's important to distinguish between what the term business class means in the international context and what it means in the domestic context. We all get on airplanes and we walk through and we see, people in first class. We may not see them because they're up front and we get on a little bit behind that. And then we see people in business class. For a domestic flight, what is that? That is a chair that is more comfortable. It's wider. It maybe is a little more plush. It's a little more leg room. That's domestic business class. That's not international business class at all. I flew to Port Revel last year on my own nickel, may I say, and I learned a lot. I was able to function when I got there because I flew business class. What's different? What's different is that the equipment, the seat, is not a chair, it's a pod. And it reclines so that you are able to lie 180 degrees. You can lie down flat on your back, on your side. You can, if you like to sleep in a fetal position, which I do, you can bring your knees up to your chest. And it's just shrouded, so you don't get the sense that there are 100 people walking back and forth in front of you. You get the opportunity for rest, and it mitigates the effects on your circadian rhythms of traveling over 8 time zones and 16 hours. There are other ways to save money. We could fly on an airline nobody ever heard of that's still flying Soviet-era Ilyushins and Tupolevs. I would call those unsafe at any altitude, making 3 stops instead of 1. There are lots of ways to save money, but at some point you have to make a policy choice about what's the best thing to do. I think the best thing to do in terms of husbanding our resources, we've paid $35,200 per pilot to send them to this manned model training program. To get our money's worth, we want them to show up and be awake, not zombies when they get there. If they have to sit up on the airplane for 16 or 18 hours, they'll be zombies, I guarantee it. Returning, same issue, except this time it's safety. They go back on the board, they go back to work, and you don't want them to be fatigued. You can mitigate that by, and this is not general fund money. This is a tiny increment to the continuing education surcharge. Do the math, 8,000 moves a year, it's $6 a move. That's all it is. $6 every time a ship moves gives you the marginal amount you need for the transit. So those are two items.
Thank you. On that note, I actually think it's a really good time to bring up Mike Jacob with the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association, some of the folks who pay the surcharges for training and for pensions and the rates that are set, and give them an opportunity to kind of chime in on the recommendations by staff and the comments made here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chairman, Senators, Assembly members. I am Mike Jacob with Pacific Merchant Shipping Association, and I'd like to give you a quick introduction about who we are and our role in the system, and then speak directly to the recommendations of the committee. And we're happy to be participating today. We think the staff report is very well done, and I echo the comments made a little bit earlier by the Commissioner and Executive Director that the process itself is helpful in terms of ongoing oversight and accountability and transparency, and focusing us on issues. Maybe segue directly into the comments that were just made. We have a very large commitment to the pilotage district in San Francisco to make sure that it's run well, to make sure we have effective and safe service from pilots, and that those pilots are well trained, that they have every possible thing they could ask for to do their job well and safely. And that total commitment from last year eclipsed $50 million for the first time in terms of the total cost of the overhead of the state pilotage system. And to put that into perspective with respect to what it costs for us to do business within that pilotage district, on an annual basis, our longshore labor costs between the ports of Sacramento, Stockton, Richmond, Oakland, San Francisco, Redwood City, for 1,400 registrants is about $130 million. It's our actual lease revenue to the Port of Oakland, which is the 5th largest container port in the country, is about $140 million. And that pays for a lot of their overhead, including their staff, finances $1.4 billion of revenue bond debt, and is a testament to the fact that you can make public-private partnerships work in California in terms of taking private dollars, investing in public infrastructure. You put that in the context of that's how much it costs to run a port for us in terms of overhead, $140 million. Our longshore labor force, $130 million, 1,400 registrants. We pay $50 million, which on a per pilot basis has an overhead of about $900,000 in cost. So we're very committed to making pilotage work, but that also means we're also very interested in making sure when it works effectively, it's efficient, and we're not spending money here we don't have to spend to receive the service that we want to receive. So, with that being said, I think it is fair to say that we, for just general purposes, endorse the report. We endorse the report's recommendations. We think the report's been well done. And in the context of where we're moving since Costco-Busan with the legislature's passage of SB 1627, SB 1217, what we have is a continued process of improvement at the Commission towards accountability and transparency. You've heard a lot from the auditor about the things they recommended. Most of those have been done. You've heard from the staff about how they've had staff transitions. Those for the most part, have made the Commission better. They're working towards getting better. And these recommendations move in the same way. And I think it's worth saying that for a long time, because they were an independent commission, they did not have the support of an agency. Now they do with Business Transportation Housing. And that agency structure has actually benefited the board to a great degree. They have resources that they didn't have before. And so in actually implementing your recommendations, they can draw on those resources now where they could not before. And the general theme here is one of standardization and enforceability. And that's where all the recommendations go as well. With respect to the questions about travel and RFPs and all those things, those are basic standardization questions where when this board was independent, they didn't have to go through those processes as a practical matter, even though they did as a legal matter. But once they become standardized, then we have some growing pains with respect to how do they go through the process of procuring things. And so these recommendations, again, they just reflect the fact that the legislature has been saying now since Casca-Busan, you actually need to go through a process that's similar to every other state agency. So when you're processing things, those recommendations make a lot of sense on an administrative level. And it was the culture of the old Pilot Commission to view its role kind of as a regulator in the context of providing service and not necessarily as a licensing agency. And I think to walk into the third, fourth, and fifth recommendations with respect to training and things like that, the former Pilot Commission Executive Director told the NTSB after Casca-Busan, this is his quote, "We like to keep our heads down and handle things here, and if nobody up in Sacramento knows that we're here and we handle things, we think we're doing good." That is not the philosophy of the board now. You saw the responses they gave to this commission, this committee, in terms of really good self-report, embracing the fact that the statutes have changed in terms of providing them with access to support they never had before, and making sure their administrative processes are standardized. That's huge. That's a huge sea change. And the recommendations with respect to the NTSB go further to make sure that what we have is a system where we have rules that are enforceable. So right now, we would not begrudge the fact that the pilots and the board do a relatively good job of making sure that they have pilots that are well rested on most ships, that we do not have incidents. And that's something that is the ultimate goal of everybody in the system. What we don't have are enforceable standards. And that's what I think the main goal of those recommendations are. Those would be our main goals, and I think it's the main goal of the NTSB in putting those forward. It's not just good enough to have guidelines. It's not just good enough to have a voluntary system, but it's important to have enforceability with your standards, because otherwise the standards don't really mean very much. And I think we agree that, I think everyone around the table would agree, no vessel should ever have a pilot dispatched to them that is potentially so fatigued that it's unsafe. Nobody wants that outcome. And certainly in the context of the fact that we do not get to choose who our pilots are because there is a statutory monopoly, we don't get to choose who gets dispatched to us or not. So the thing that we need to put faith in as consumers is the fact that our licensing board and that the agency that regulates those licensees has enforceable standards that we can rely on. So when someone is dispatched, we know that they're safe. We know that they've had their training. We know that they've gone through the physicals they're supposed to go through. And we know they're not fatigued. That's the importance of the NTSB recommendation. And frankly, it's also the importance of the recommendation that speaks directly to the need of the board when they're going through a process of doing minimum rest period rules. They need to rely on real data. They need to actually rely on the piloting logs. And not necessarily just the minimum rest period violation data that they've been provided up till now. Because under the current data, you can't tell when someone's actually working. You can only tell when they're dispatched. And the committee report does reference to a recent tax court case, which we think is illustrative of the fact that it's hard to tell from dispatch data when someone's actually working. The IRS, in that case, wanted to base a pilot's working hours based on their dispatch time. The pilot in that case actually disagreed, and the tax court agreed with the pilot that the actual time they were working wasn't the time that they were dispatched. It was the time they were actually on board a ship. And the reason for that is, and when you're doing minimum rest periods, you have to take into account all the travel time, all the dispatch time. You have to know everything. But at the end of the day, the reason why the tax court agreed with the pilot was because he said, during my dispatch time, I might be sleeping, I might be watching TV, I might be fishing, I might be conducting other business by telephone that has nothing to do with pilotage. So when you're breaking down what's really happening during a pilot's day, when is he resting, when is he working, we need to be actually looking at the actual data and the pilot logs that are associated with that. So we think that's of critical importance when you're going through that process. And then I think the last thing is that there's one caveat to the comments you just heard from the commission president, which is that the pilotage monopoly is a monopoly, and with that benefit that the state endows on them as service providers come responsibilities. And we like to say that when there's compulsory pilotage, then pilotage is compulsory, which is to say that even if it's inconvenient for the pilots, even if it makes it hard for them to maintain their current inefficient dispatch system, they don't get to choose to not service a vessel. As long as they're following all the standards and all the guidelines that are required for safety, they need to actually provide us service when we ask for service. And so there should never be a situation where ships are turning donuts outside anywhere, or that ships aren't moving when they're supposed to be moving. The entire purpose of having manpower decisions at the board is for the board to be able to make a determination about whether or not there's actually enough licensed pilots to do the jobs that are necessary within the pilotage ground. And so if there's actual real problems with not having enough pilots to move the number of ships we need to move, then we can address that. But again, that can only happen when you have real data about when people are working, when they aren't working. And our initial estimates are that pilots, when they're on duty, so they're on duty every other week, but for those times when they're on duty, they're still actually on board a vessel for about 3.5 hours per day. So we think even accounting for the travel time, even accounting for dispatch time, there will be plenty of ability to get pilots to the ships, do it safely, and do it in the context of having enforceable standards with respect to rest. And on the last two recommendations, just want to say really briefly on pilot pension, the committee report actually does a good job of summarizing some of our concerns with the administration of the pension. And because we have submitted actual petitions to the Office of Administrative Law and requests for opinions at the U.S. Department of Labor, we'd like to, and those processes are ongoing and they're pending, so we don't want to comment further than the staff report other than say we think the staff report has actually done a good job of summarizing those things. And then on the only legislative recommendation that's in the report is on the ALJ rate setting. We haven't talked about that before during this committee hearing, but we view that as an extremely valuable recommendation. We supported the renewal of the ALJ process in the mid-90s. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And I'd prefer not to get any specifics about the rates here because I don't think it's the appropriate forum. It's good that the report steered away from that because this should be about the process of how do you effectively govern the system, not necessarily what the actual rates are. But with respect to the ALJ process and governance, there's a couple of points that I think are worth bringing up really, really quickly. One is that the ALJ process is actually geared towards evaluating evidence and weighing evidence in the context of a hearing. And the pilot commission, while they do as good a job as they can, they just aren't equipped to do that. They don't have the staff resources to do it. They can't provide any independent evaluation of the evidence that's proffered. And they can't actually evaluate whether or not any of the economic claims are real or not. They also aren't set up to make specific evidentiary findings or rulings about what is the basis for a rate recommendation to the legislature or not. This really should not go without saying, but the pilot commission is inherently conflicted on these items. So there are two pilot members that when they're asked to vote on rate recommendations, they're being asked to vote on their own pay and the pay of their business partners because they're all partners in the same ongoing concern that's a monopoly. That's a problem for us. And it shouldn't also be understated that there's a conflict with respect to the industry members, which are on the commission as well. Because not only are you voting directly on what your employer may or may not pay for that service, but you're also voting as a representative of a company whether or not to tell your only service provider in that marketplace what you want to pay them. And that has certain economic marketplace risks as well. Nobody wants to be the company that voted to reduce the pay of the person you have to call the next day and ask for service. So those conflicts are there. They're inherent. if you go through a board process, but those conflicts get removed in the ALJ process, so I think it would add to a lot of objectivity in the process itself. And then, just in conclusion, I would say that there's one thing that we think is missing from the report, which would be a recommendation to the legislature to do ongoing review of the board, either in the context of something like sunset review or well, let's put it this way. There's no standardized review like there is for many other licensing boards in DCA. And whether or not this is the correct process for that or not, I don't know. Whether or not it's through the endorsement of a sunset date for the board, I don't know. But at least at some point in time, what we do know is that through the Costco-Busan legislation and through this board and through the audit, that when there is additional legislative scrutiny, good things happen. The board gets better, and they make improvements in their administration. So that's something that we'd like to have institutionalized. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just for the record, the Sunset Review Committee's goal is to go through the entire government structure and then go through it again. That is the periodic review that we hope to achieve with this committee. We do not have a sunset date on the Board of Pilot Commissioners, but since we did run a bill to set that date to have them reviewed, this is kind of the review without the hammer on the end of the potential sunset. My goal is that eventually everybody would have those dates that would trigger the reviews, but this one would probably be off by 12 years at least to allow us the time to review everybody else. But thank you very much for your comments. We do have on our agenda public comment, but I want to see if any members have any question for our industry representative. Senator Emerson.
I don't know really where to start here, but I presume your industry comes under the Public Utilities Commission when you establish rates for hauling goods?
Well, it's a good question, and no, because we're either in interstate or international commerce. The primary regulator of our actual rate setting is the Federal Maritime Commission. It's done through the Shipping Act. But let me say this: if there were carriers of non-cargo carriers on the water, so you're just passenger carriers or you're in just domestic waters, you would almost never have a pilot on board either under the licensing statute that exists for the board right now. So just unique to the situation that exists with respect to who's licensed or who's required to take a licensed pilot under the state licensing statutes that we have right now. Our members wouldn't be impacted by that. Yeah.
But it's not a legislative body that regulates your ability for charges.
That's fundamentally correct. That's right. When we enter into tariffs as ocean carriers or as marine terminal operators, my members need to make them public. They need to conform with federal law, but there's no one that dictates to them what the terms of those tariffs need to be.
So when you go into different ports, are the rates for piloting widely differing?
Yes. Yeah.
And how do you rate the San Francisco Bay pilots' rates? Are they higher, in the middle, or where?
Yeah, you know what? It's a great question. They're higher. The question about what are they higher relative to is a good question. Right now, they're higher to where they've been historically for the San Francisco Bay. That was our focus of our rate petition from the board last year. They're also higher with respect to other West Coast ports when you look at the entirety of the cost of maintaining the pilotage system. So if you just pull out the fees that we pay to the pilots themselves, but you don't include the litany of surcharges for the pension, for the board administration, for the pilot vessels, and for the training and for the continuing education, when you add all those on, it's significantly high with, just comparison to other pilotage grounds.
And you are charged. How are you charged? I know you made some comment about when you make the call versus when they board the ship.
Mm-hmm.
are you charged from when you make the call?
No, I mean the billing that the pilots use is actually usually pretty straightforward, and they do a very good job of informing their customers what their rules are. They have a set of guidelines that actually we'd like to have codified because we think they're really good. And what they do is they'll provide the service. There's a service code listing that the legislature's incorporated by reference to their rates. And so everyone has a good idea of what their charges are going to be ahead of time. And most of our members are regular callers. So you know generally what your ship is going to be charged in the ballpark of. And then they have a billing and invoicing process that comes on the tail end of your actual service.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your input. We do have public comment on the agenda, and so I want to open it up to anybody who might be here that has any comment on the recommendations in the report or anything they've heard today. Seeing none, we're going to take the comments that were made at today's hearing, look over the draft staff report and any recommendations that we need to bring to the entire Sunset Review Committee for a vote. We will do at our next hearing, either in the beginning or at the end, for adopting those recommendations so that we have something solidified for folks to the extent that a legislative solution gets adopted, and then we'll have a bill prepared where members can sign on to that. Oh, sir, absolutely, sorry. Vice Chair.
Now, I've probably been here the longest as a legislature, 11 years, and up until the last 3 days, I never knew what a bar pilot did. Never knew what a bar pilot was. I just knew we did legislation, we did different things. And the same thing for the shipping. So I think it behooves the entire industry, both the bar pilots, the board, the shipping, to come and talk to legislators during the years that maybe you do like a legislative thing for all the new people that come in, because until the last 3 days, now I know all about you, I can recite it, I know what you all do. So I think
Are you going to apply for a job?
no, I'm too fat to climb the ropes. And I'm too short. I couldn't reach the things between. Yes. But so I think that just in the interest of you letting people know what you all do, then when things come before us, we actually know who you are, what you do, and we don't think that you're pilots that sit at bars. Okay? All right. Thank you.
Thank you. And that is certainly part of the reason we have the legislature involved in reviewing all these boards and commissions. Just a little bit of personal privilege here. There was a lot of debate when we were starting the Sunset Review process about having an external commission do these reviews. And I fought very hard for making sure the legislature had skin in the game and that we were at the table when these discussions were happening so that we didn't just get another report that would sit and collect dust that nobody did anything with. And I think that there is value in having this process in the legislature. I want to thank everybody for participating today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Sunset Review Committee hearing. Thank you.